Italy, autumn of 1943. A road winds through the Apennine foothills, cracked stone, olive trees, the faint smell of diesel and burnt rubber. And there, sitting motionless in the dust, is a tiger. Not burning. Not shot. Just dead. Its crew is gone. The hatches hang open like the jaws of a beast that forgot how to breathe. British soldiers approach cautiously, rifles ready, expecting a trick. But the engine is silent. The air smells of oil and failure. They circle the machine, awed and curious. This was the monster that had haunted Allied tanks from Tunisia to Kursk, the Tiger I, Germany's invincible pride. Its armor could shrug off a 6-pounder shell. Its 88mm gun could split a Sherman like paper. Yet here it was, defeated by something invisible. When the recovery team drags the Tiger back to the School of Tank Technology near Chobham, one man waits beside the loading dock. He's not a soldier. He's not even an engineer in uniform. He wears a tweed coat, his pockets lined with pencils and a small notebook smudged with graphite. Dr. Robert Stevenson. Metallurgist. Listener of steel. He has examined shattered crankshafts from Spitfires, broken landing gears from bombers, and now, the gears of a Tiger. He runs his hand along the transmission housing, rough and cold. A hairline crack catches his fingertip like a whisper. He murmurs almost to himself, "Steel doesn't lie. It only tells us what we did to it." Inside the lab, the Tiger's heart is opened. The gearbox, the final drive, a complex web of teeth and shafts, is laid bare under the yellow glow of lamps. Every captured Tiger seems to arrive this way, intact, unburned, but broken deep inside. More Tigers, it turns out, are lost to their own machinery than to any Allied gun. Stevenson peers through the magnifier. The tooth of one gear is cracked clean through as if it were glass. Another is missing entirely, sheared off under stress. He feels the texture, hard, brittle, crystalline. Too hard, perhaps. He frowns. Hardness, he says softly, isn't strength. It's pride without humility. He notes every detail, fracture pattern, grain texture, the faint bluish tint of overheated steel. Then he steps back and exhales. This isn't battlefield damage, he mutters. It's born in the furnace. Outside, trucks rumble past carrying fresh wrecks from the front, Panthers, half-tracks, and another Tiger. Each tells the same story, the machines built to dominate the war are dying from within. Somewhere in Berlin, engineers are rushing production, pushing furnaces beyond safe limits, skipping tempering cycles to meet impossible quotas. But Stevenson doesn't know that yet. All he knows is what the metal reveals, a silent confession buried in every shattered tooth. He scratches a note in his book, failure not random, systemic. Brittle case. Over-hardened surface. Likely untempered martensite. Words that, to anyone else, mean little. But to him they mean everything. Because if the flaw is real, if this brittleness runs through every Tiger gearbox, then Germany's most feared weapon has a secret weakness. A weakness that can be provoked. A flaw that can be exploited. The discovery feels almost heretical. How could a nation famed for precision engineering produce something so fragile? But the evidence is right there, gleaming under the microscope. Perfection, pushed too far, becomes self-destruction. That night, Stevenson sits alone in the lab. Rain taps against the windows. The Tiger's gears rest on a workbench before him, fragments glinting like broken teeth from a mechanical predator. He lights a cigarette and watches the smoke curl into the darkness. In the stillness, he feels the weight of the war, the countless lives shaped by machines like this one. He thinks of the factory workers, the forced laborers, the engineers under pressure. He imagines them cutting corners, rushing the heat treatment, watching the clock while bombers roar overhead. And he realizes, this failure isn't just technical. It's human. Somewhere between ambition and exhaustion, between science and desperation, the Tiger had lost its soul. Its own perfection had turned against it. Its steel had become its enemy. Stevenson closes his notebook. Outside, thunder rolls across the English sky. He whispers, the Tiger didn't die in battle. It broke itself. Pause. Then, with quiet determination, he adds one last line to his notes, find out why. By 1943, the war had entered its grinding middle years, a war no longer decided by surprise or blitzkrieg but by endurance. Germany, once an industrial titan, was beginning to strain under the weight of its own machines. Steel was still being poured, but the furnaces were tired. The men who once shaped that steel were gone, drafted, wounded, or buried on distant fronts. In their place stood teenagers, old men, and laborers dragged from occupied lands. The tempo of production didn't slow, it accelerated. The Reich demanded thousands of tanks a month, even as its cities burned under Allied bombs. Factories ran night and day, flickering under the red glow of molten metal. The Tiger tank, the symbol of Nazi might, rolled off assembly lines at Henschel and Kassel, each one consuming hundreds of thousands of man-hours. It was a masterpiece of engineering but a nightmare of manufacturing. Every Tiger weighed nearly 60 tons. Its armor was thick enough to deflect almost anything the Allies could fire. Its main gun, the 88mm KWK-36, could punch through a Sherman at more than a mile. To Hitler, it was a mechanical manifestation of German superiority. To his engineers, it was a creature of impossible demands. Inside every Tiger, beneath the armor plates and roaring Maybach engine, hid a fragile secret, a gearbox designed to transfer that immense power to the tracks. It was the final drive, the beating heart of motion. And it was unforgiving. The Tiger's transmission required tolerances so tight that even a small error in heat treatment could mean disaster. The gear teeth had to be hard enough to resist wear, but not so hard that they shattered. It was metallurgy on a knife's edge. And by 1943, that knife was beginning to dull. At first, no one dared to question it. Reports from the Eastern Front spoke of Tigers immobilized in the field, abandoned not because of enemy fire but because of broken drives. Commanders blamed terrain, mud, or inexperienced crews. But the pattern kept repeating. The Tigers were dying not from combat, but from their own perfection. Behind those failures lay a chain of small, desperate choices. In Kassel, heat treatment furnaces were overloaded. Quenching times were shortened to save fuel. Tempering, the slow reheating that gives steel its resilience, was skipped or rushed. Skilled metallurgists were gone. Their replacements followed instructions but didn't understand the metal's mood. And so, the gears came out of the furnaces gleaming and hard, too hard. They passed inspection because they looked flawless. But inside, they carried invisible fractures waiting to grow. Steel, as Stevenson would later say, remembers everything, every shortcut, every moment of stress. Meanwhile, across the Channel, another kind of war was being fought, a quieter one in white coats and laboratories. In London, the School of Tank Technology had become a place of dissection and discovery. Every captured German vehicle was treated like an alien specimen. Engines were stripped, armor samples sliced, transmissions disassembled tooth by tooth. The scientists weren't warriors. But their findings shaped how warriors fought. Among them, British and American metallurgists compared notes under the dim light of microscopes. They measured hardness, mapped crystal structures, and debated the logic behind German steelmaking. Why were their alloys so brittle? Why did the finest engineering minds in Europe allow such fragility? To them, it was a puzzle that cut across science and psychology. In 1943, the Allies had already learned to respect the Tiger, and to fear it. On the battlefield, it seemed almost supernatural. Sherman crews spoke of shells bouncing off at close range. Infantrymen whispered about its deep mechanical growl that echoed through the hedgerows before a battle. But in the labs of Chobham and Farnborough, that fear began to erode. Each disassembled component told a new truth. The Tiger was magnificent but over-engineered. Its complexity demanded perfection in an imperfect world. Every bearing, every gear, every bolt required precision that wartime Germany could no longer guarantee. And once those standards slipped, the machine's strength became its undoing. Stevenson, though still a minor name in those reports, started compiling failures from multiple recovered tanks. One from Tunisia, another from Sicily, another from a wreck shipped from Normandy. Every one showed the same signature: cracked gear teeth, fractured cases, splintered shafts. He called it a systemic fragility masked by excellence. For the Allies, this revelation carried weight far beyond the laboratory. It meant that the Tiger, for all its armor and arrogance, had a soft underbelly, not of metal but of method. A nation obsessed with power had forgotten humility in design. In Sheffield, in Detroit, in Glasgow, Allied engineers took the opposite path. Their tanks weren't perfect. They were practical, easy to build, easy to repair, easy to improve. And that difference, art versus utility, was slowly turning the tide of the industrial war. As 1943 bled into 1944, the contrast sharpened. Germany's industry fought exhaustion, the Allies fought with momentum. German tanks grew heavier, slower, more fragile. American and British tanks rolled out by the thousands, backed by a supply chain that stretched across oceans. It wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a collision of philosophies, one built on pride, the other on adaptability. Back in Chobham, Stevenson watched as the cracked Tiger gears were catalogued and stored. He didn't yet know what his notes would lead to, that his quiet analysis would find its way into Allied field manuals. But in his heart he sensed something profound. The enemy's greatest machine was not unbeatable. It was already defeating itself. In the war of steel and sweat, victory would not belong to the nation with the hardest armor. It would belong to the one that understood why steel breaks, and how to keep it from breaking again. Before the war, Robert Stevenson wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even interested in weapons. He was a man of furnaces and forges, a metallurgist from Sheffield, the city that once armed an empire with steel. Born in 1903, the son of a mill foreman, he grew up in a world of soot and fire. His childhood memories were not of fields or games, but of molten metal pouring from ladles like liquid sunlight. He remembered his father's words, shouted over the roar of the foundry, "Steel remembers how you treat it, lad. If you rush it, it'll pay you back in cracks." That idea stayed with him. To Stevenson, steel was never just material, it was memory frozen in metal. Every vibration, every heat cycle, every careless shortcut left a trace, a story etched inside its grain. By the 1930s, he had become one of Britain's most respected experts in heat treatment, writing papers on alloy behavior under stress and fatigue. When war broke out, his skills became a weapon in their own right. In 1940 he was assigned to the newly formed School of Tank Technology, a discreet establishment on the outskirts of London. Its mission wasn't to design tanks, it was to understand them, every nut and bolt, every failure and flaw. Captured enemy armor arrived there in pieces like bodies for autopsy. Stevenson's role was simple: listen to the steel. He walked the corridors of the school like a quiet ghost, pipe in hand, always listening, not to people but to metal under strain. He had a calm way about him, almost professorial, yet his eyes carried the exhaustion of a man who'd seen too many broken things. He spent nights hunched over microscopes, studying fracture lines that looked like frozen rivers. Each line told a story, of stress, temperature, or negligence. The other engineers joked that Stevenson could talk to the gearboxes. He never corrected them. Because in a way it was true. He believed metal carried intent. You could see it in the texture of steel that had been properly tempered, a smooth, confident grain, compared to the angry, jagged crystals of metal that had been rushed through the furnace. One looked alive, the other looked afraid. When the first Tiger components arrived from North Africa, Stevenson immediately sensed something wrong. The gears were beautiful, flawless to the eye, yet somehow lifeless. He tapped one gently with a hammer. The sound was high and sharp, almost brittle. "Too proud," he whispered. "It doesn't bend. It refuses to forgive." That whisper summed up his philosophy. In metallurgy, forgiveness is strength, the ability of steel to yield just enough under stress before it breaks. The Germans, he realized, had engineered arrogance into their machines. Their steel didn't forgive. Among his peers, Stevenson was known for his patience. He could spend hours polishing a tiny cross-section of metal, revealing the microstructure hidden within. He kept a small notebook beside him, filled with sketches of crystal formations and cryptic observations like tempered martensite equals wisdom, or grain boundaries equals scars of experience. To outsiders, his language bordered on poetry. To metallurgists, it was truth. He wasn't motivated by glory or patriotism. What drove him was curiosity, the need to understand why things failed. To him, every broken tank, every cracked propeller, every shattered gear was an opportunity to learn something about human decision-making under pressure. He often said, "We don't fight the enemy. We fight our own mistakes." In 1943, as the war intensified, Stevenson's workload doubled. Reports from field units poured in, Tigers abandoned in perfect condition, transmissions seized, engines fine but gears destroyed. He began to see a pattern emerging, something systemic. And patterns to Stevenson were everything. He invited young apprentices to his lab, many straight from technical colleges. They were drawn to his calm authority, his unshakable sense of purpose. He'd show them the cross-sections under the microscope and say, "Look closely. That crack began before the tank ever saw battle. That's not war damage, that's impatience." The students would nod, half understanding, half in awe. He made metallurgy feel almost spiritual, a conversation between man and matter. Outside the lab, bombs sometimes fell over London. The windows rattled, dust drifted down from the rafters. Stevenson barely flinched. He would simply pause, listen, then continue tracing lines on the metal surface with a magnifying lens. One night, after a particularly heavy air raid, he walked home through the dim streets of Surrey. The blackout curtains glowed faintly from hidden candles. He thought of Germany, of men like him, metallurgists on the other side, working in haste, under fear, perhaps making the same compromises he refused to make. He didn't hate them. He pitied them. "Metal doesn't care who you are," he once told a colleague. "It only obeys the laws of nature. And nature doesn't take sides." That impartiality made him invaluable, and a little lonely. In a world defined by allies and enemies, Stevenson belonged to the quiet brotherhood of scientists who believed that truth itself was patriotic. By the summer of 1943, he had built a modest reputation among military engineers. Whenever a tank transmission arrived cracked or fused, the note on the crate often read simply, "For Stevenson." He would lift the lid like a priest opening a reliquary and begin his ritual: inspect, test, listen. And when the Tiger's transmission arrived, twisted and silent, something in him stirred. It wasn't excitement, it was recognition. He'd seen pride like this before, in the brittle edges of over-tempered tool steel from peacetime factories. Steel that glittered like silver but broke like glass. Perfection hiding weakness. To most, the Tiger was an engine of terror. To Stevenson, it was a patient on the table, whispering its final confession. He wasn't aware yet that his quiet observations would ripple outward, that his notes would find their way to Allied commanders and reshape battlefield tactics. To him, it was just another mystery of metal. But deep down he understood what the cracks meant. They weren't random. They were evidence of a civilization pushed beyond its limits, of an industry burning itself out in pursuit of invincibility. He looked again through the microscope, tracing the delicate boundaries between martensite and ferrite, light and dark. In those lines he saw more than chemistry, he saw humanity. And in that moment, Robert Stevenson realized that war was not only a contest of armies or weapons. It was a contest of minds, of who could learn faster, adapt sooner, and understand the materials that defined the modern world. He closed his notebook, slipped it into his coat pocket, and whispered the words his father once told him, "Steel remembers." For the first time since the war began, Stevenson smiled. Because he finally understood what the steel had been trying to tell him all along. The crate arrived under a gray English sky. Stenciled in black paint, Transmission Assembly PZKPFW6, Tiger. It was heavy, nearly half a ton of German engineering, precision gears, shafts, and bearings, all cold and silent now. Dr. Robert Stevenson and his small team stood around it in the laboratory at the School of Tank Technology. No one spoke for a while. Even among engineers hardened by years of dissection, the Tiger still carried an aura, a machine whispered to be indestructible, a legend forged in steel. Stevenson leaned closer. The gearbox housing was scarred from transport, but the internals gleamed. Perfect machining. Mirror-polished teeth. German markings etched cleanly into each gear. He could almost feel the arrogance of design radiating from the metal. But beauty, he knew, was not truth. He began with the simplest test, a visual inspection. The gear teeth were pristine, no pitting, no corrosion. And yet, along the roots of several teeth, hairline cracks glimmered under the light. Tiny, almost invisible. But unmistakable. He ran a fingernail over one. The sound it made, that faint dry scratch, told him everything. "Cracked," he murmured. "And not from battle." His assistant, Lieutenant Morris, looked puzzled. Could it be from stress? Maybe a jam during operation? Stevenson shook his head. No. These cracks were born in the furnace, not the field. The analysis began. Samples were cut from the fractured gear and mounted in resin, polished until the surface shone like glass. Then came the etching, a drop of nitric acid revealing the hidden structure within. Under the microscope, the truth emerged. The metal was brilliant, almost dazzling, but unnatural. A fine, needle-like pattern spread across the surface like frost on glass. Martensite, Stevenson whispered. But, untempered. The room fell silent. They all knew what that meant. When steel is hardened, it's heated and then rapidly cooled, quenched, to form martensite, a hard but brittle phase. Normally that steel is reheated or tempered, to restore toughness and relieve internal stress. But this gear, it had skipped that forgiveness. It was pure, untempered martensite, the metallurgical equivalent of glass pretending to be diamond. Stevenson jotted a note: surface hardness, HRC 62 to 64. Core brittle. Improper tempering. He paused, then added underlined words: systemic error, not local defect. They ran more tests. Rockwell hardness indentation tests across the cross-section revealed a clear pattern. The surface was extremely hard, even harder than British tool steel standards. But just a few millimeters below, the hardness dropped sharply, then plateaued in a brittle zone. In other words, the gears were built like porcelain shells. They could withstand enormous stress, until they couldn't. Magnificent over-engineering, Morris muttered. Stevenson gave a quiet nod. Or magnificent misunderstanding. He knew exactly what had happened. German factories, under immense wartime pressure, had been ordered to increase output. Experienced metallurgists were gone, drafted, dead, or working in bombed-out plants. In their place were rushed apprentices and laborers, working around the clock with limited resources. To meet demand, furnaces were overloaded. Cooling baths reused oil that had lost its viscosity. Temperature gauges drifted out of calibration. And somewhere in the chaos, the crucial tempering cycle, the step that turned hardness into resilience, was skipped or shortened. The result? Steel that passed every inspection for appearance and surface hardness, but failed the test of life. Stevenson sat alone that night, studying the fracture under magnification. Each crack propagated in perfect lines, as if the metal had tried to split itself cleanly without resistance. No plastic deformation. No struggle. It broke the moment it was asked to flex. He imagined the German tank crews, proud, confident, pushing their Tiger forward through mud and rock. The massive Maybach engine roaring, torque surging through the gearbox. And then, suddenly, silence. A tooth snapping. A cascade of fractures. A war machine brought to its knees by a microscopic mistake. He sighed. Perfection, he said softly, is sometimes just fragility wearing a uniform. By dawn he compiled his first report. It was clinical, precise, and damning. Subject: analysis of Tiger tank transmission components findings. Surface hardness: Rockwell C62 to 64, excessive. Core structure: untempered martensite, high residual stress. Failure mechanism: brittle fracture under torsional load. Probable cause: omission or reduction of tempering process during heat treatment. Conclusion: systemic manufacturing fault. He didn't write what he really thought, that the flaw was philosophical, not mechanical. Germany's obsession with perfection had created a machine too precise for its own survival. Later that week, a shipment of captured German armor components arrived, not just from Tigers but from Panthers and half-tracks. Stevenson repeated the tests. The same result. High hardness. Low tolerance. No forgiveness. Each failure pattern told the same story. A production system stretched beyond control, engineers sacrificing reliability for performance, and managers too proud to slow down. He gave a lecture to senior analysts at Farnborough. Charts, graphs, and micrographs projected on a wall. To most, it was a technical presentation. To Stevenson, it was a moral one. Gentlemen, he began, the Tiger is not dying of battle wounds. It's dying of impatience. He explained how overhardening creates internal tension. How even a perfect design can collapse if the process behind it forgets humility. He pointed to a slide showing the fractured gear tooth under polarized light. Notice these lines, the intergranular fractures. That's the metal's way of telling us, I was rushed. I was not allowed to rest. There was silence in the room. One officer finally said, so they built too well and too fast. Stevenson nodded. Exactly. They built perfection and forgot resilience. Later in private notes he wrote, war accelerates everything, progress, mistakes, fatigue. But steel remembers. It tells the truth that propaganda can't. His findings began circulating quietly through British and American technical units. Designers studying captured tigers began to appreciate the paradox, that the enemy's greatest strength could also be its weakness. Not just tactically but philosophically. Stevenson didn't see it as triumph. He saw it as tragedy. Somewhere in a German factory, another metallurgist, perhaps just as devoted as he was, had likely made the same realization too late. Weeks later, a field report reached London from Italy. A British recovery unit had found another Tiger abandoned, gearbox jammed, no battle damage. Inside, the same fractures. Same signature. Same story written in steel. Stevenson read the message and closed his eyes. It confirmed what he already knew: this was no coincidence. The flaw was woven into the Tiger's very DNA. He wrote one final line in his logbook before filing the report. The enemy's steel is stronger than ours, but their process is weaker. And process, not power, decides endurance. He looked up at the quiet lab around him. The hum of the lights. The ticking of the hardness tester. And he realized something profound. War at its core wasn't just a contest of courage or firepower. It was a contest of discipline, of who respected the invisible laws of material, time, and patience. The Tiger tank was a masterpiece, but one that had forgotten humility. And in war, as in metallurgy, pride always leaves a crack. When Stevenson sealed his report and stamped it, for technical channels only, he did not expect a parade of generals to gather in his doorway. He expected quiet men in white coats, the slow, exacting exchange of observations between laboratories. What he did not expect was speed. The paper moved like a message in a bottle tossed into a fast current. A copy crossed the Atlantic, read by engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground, artillery officers in Washington, and armored divisions hungry for any edge. Words on a page became actions within days. At Aberdeen, the sprawling proving ground outside Baltimore, engineers prided themselves on a single creed: test what you can touch. They did not accept theory alone. They built rigs, instruments, and mock courses to break things deliberately and learn why they failed. Stevenson's note arrived just as a shipment of captured German parts did. The timing felt almost providential. Lieutenant Colonel James Whittaker, head of mechanized testing at Aberdeen, gathered his small team in a dim trailer stacked with scale models and schematic prints. They were men who measured torque in their sleep and loved the blunt honesty of a broken part. Whittaker read Stevenson's summary aloud, lips moving over sentences that spoke of overhardened surfaces, skipped tempering cycles, and brittle martensite. He listened, then folded the paper and said simply, "We'll make it speak." The Americans were not content to accept the neat line of a laboratory report. They wanted to stress the gearbox, to find the movement that would force those perfect teeth to fail. So they engineered a test that reflected what tanks actually had to do in battle. Sudden stops, rapid reversals, tight turning under load. They bolted captured Tiger gears into rigs, applied torque until instruments screamed, and watched fractures propagate under high-speed cameras. Every test confirmed Stevenson's reading. Under rapid torsional shock, the gear teeth split like glass. Under gentle, forgiving torque, they endured. Word of a method traveled fast among tankers. In training camps from Fort Knox to Camp Borden, commanders put new emphasis on motion and stress. It was not about shooting the Tiger first. It was about making the Tiger move in ways it could not tolerate. The idea was at once simple and profound. If a machine's weakness was in its temperament, then provoke its temperament. Field units received terse circulars. Avoid head-on slugfests when possible. If a Tiger appeared, do not attempt to outgun it. Instead, maneuver. Force it into rapid pivots. Make it climb a steep bank, then reverse. Make it shift from crawl to sprint, then wheel sharply. In practice, these maneuvers did not require new weapons. They required nerves, coordination, and mechanical understanding. They required the American way. Patton's armored units, proud and aggressive, did not always welcome a doctrine that favored cunning over sheer force. But intelligence and training officers pressed the point. They gave tank commanders techniques built on metallurgy rather than muscle. They taught turret discipline, throttle modulation, and how to bait an opponent into correcting course. The men who turned these lessons into rules were not philosophers. They were mechanics and tacticians who loved the engineering of war. In Italy and later in Normandy, these lessons began to show themselves. A Sherman section, light and nimble, would feint, then suddenly throttle forward to force a Tiger to swing its weight into a sharp turn. Tracks would bite into gravel while the Tiger strained to pivot. The heavy transmission would stutter, a gear tooth would fail, and the great beast would go silent. It was not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. It was mechanical and procedural. But it saved lives. Field reports became small, careful stories. "Engaged enemy armor at grid reference X," wrote a platoon leader in a terse field cable. "Forcing rapid maneuvers caused gearbox failure in 2 instances. Enemy crew abandoned vehicle intact." Commanders who had long fretted about the Tiger's invulnerability began to breathe differently. Confidence grew not from hubris but from method. Beyond the battlefield, the Americans applied their institutional muscle. Maintenance protocols were updated. Armored divisions learned how to simulate stress testing on domestic tanks to ensure their own transmissions would not suffer similar fates when pushed. Engineers who had read Stevenson's notes worked with crews to design throttle patterns that minimized wear on Shermans while maximizing stress on Tigers. It was engineering as strategy. There was an ethical current running beneath these tactical shifts. To exploit a flaw born of hurried production and human suffering felt to some like a grim calculus. But soldiers in fights do not argue about purity. They act to survive. Moreover, the flaw was not some malevolent trap. It was the consequence of a war economy that consumed standards for speed. If knowledge could tilt the balance with less bloodshed, then knowledge was also a moral weapon. At Aberdeen, a younger engineer named Samuel Pierce kept an informal diary. He wrote about the first field trailers that returned a Tiger crippled by its own gearbox. He described the quiet joy of men who had found an answer and the sober respect for a foe who had built so brilliantly and yet imperfectly. "Engineering," he penned once, "is a conversation with the enemy's mistakes." The Americans also learned a broader lesson about logistics. Stevenson's finding reinforced a cultural advantage. The Allied industrial machine prized repairability and redundancy. Shermans could be fixed quickly from the rear echelons. Parts were standardized and crews were trained to improvise. The Tiger, for all its might, relied on high-precision parts and a supply chain the Allies could strangle. When those parts failed in the field, the Tiger's manufacturers could not replace them quickly enough. That mismatch of doctrine and supply became a strategic lever. Allied commanders emphasized mobility and attrition. They pressed on supply lines, they engaged in feints, and they forced the Germans to operate their heavy tanks under conditions that revealed those brittle hearts. The result was not an immediate collapse, but a steady attrition that favored the more adaptable force. Americans in workshops and depots did more than test enemy parts. They re-examined their own assumptions. Mechanics redesigned maintenance schedules, improved heat treatment protocols and codified tempering checks for critical drive components. Lessons that began in a British lab found practical application in American factories. What was a weakness in a captured Tiger became a lesson for a better Sherman. Stories from the front reached back to the laboratories and then back to the front again. There was a peculiar loop: data in, data out, adjustment in tactics, repeat. It was the iterative intelligence that defines technological warfare. It was also an American instinct: turn knowledge into action quickly, then refine it in the field. Not all of it worked perfectly. There were false starts, misreadings, and expensive failures. A few times, commanders tried to bait a Tiger into a risky maneuver only to find themselves outgunned when the German crew anticipated the trap. Warfare remained messy and human. But over time the pattern held. The Tiger's myth of invincibility began to fray. News of engines seized by mechanical failure spread through Allied ranks. Photographs appeared in intelligence briefs. Tigers abandoned with guns intact, crews queued at a distance, helmets glinting in the sun. The images were not triumphalist. They were practical evidence of a truth discovered by instruments and intuition. On a quiet evening at Aberdeen, a small ceremony unfolded. Technicians who had run the earliest tests stood with British counterparts on a muddy field. An old British captain raised his glass and toasted the quiet men who listened to metal and turned that listening into action. It was an unadorned celebration, the kind that honors small, vital victories. In the grand sweep of the campaign, the exploitation of a metallurgical flaw did not win the war alone. But it altered engagements, saved lives, and helped to dissolve the aura surrounding the enemy's best tanks. The lesson spread beyond armor. When engineers learned to read the failures of machines, commanders learned to read the failures of strategy. Stevenson's work had shown that knowledge is a battlefield resource. But the American contribution was demonstration and application. They took a scientist's note, tested it ruthlessly, then taught soldiers how to use it. Where Britain had listened, America moved. Where Britain had diagnosed, America operationalized. It was a partnership of strengths. The British eye for detail and the American habit of rapid practical testing formed a bridge from observation to effect. That bridge turned an obscure metallurgical note into tactics that altered the calculus of armored warfare. And somewhere on an Italian hillside, a Sherman crew adjusted their throttle and waited. They watched the Tiger strain, heard the odd grinding note through their radio, and then saw the German tank drift to silence. They did not cheer loud. They checked for survivors, secured the scene, and requisitioned the vehicle for study. They did what soldiers do with a found advantage. They used it responsibly. When historians later compared battles and counted outcomes, they noted patterns. They wrote of supply chains and doctrine and the steady erosion of German armored superiority. They credited many things: air power, logistics, leadership. But the small, almost surgical exploit of a material flaw also had its place in that ledger. It is a modest tale beside the great sweep of history. Yet it captures something essential about how wars are won or lost, not only by arsenals and bravery, but by minds willing to learn, test, and adapt. That is the American way remembered in this story. Stevenson's note became a quiet instrument of change. It slipped into manuals, into the language of instructors, into the instincts of crews. An idea born in a British lab found its fullest expression through American haste and American practicality. Knowledge moved from bench to battlefield, and the battlefield in turn taught new lessons back to the bench. This was not the end of the war. It was a chapter where ingenuity edged aside dread. It was proof that understanding an enemy's weakness can sometimes be as decisive as firepower. And it was proof that in modern warfare, winning the mind is often the prelude to winning the field. The valley outside Cassino was quiet that morning, too quiet for Italy in 1944. The olive trees were still, the air heavy with the scent of fuel and dust. Through binoculars, American tank crews could see it crouched beyond the ruins of a farmhouse. A tiger. Broad, deliberate, glinting in the haze. Every man who had ever faced one knew the feeling. A tightening in the chest, the weight of inevitability. The tiger didn't have to move to command fear. Its mere presence changed the rhythm of men's hearts. But that day something was different. Inside one of the Shermans, Lieutenant David Haskell and his gunner, Corporal Rains, were calm. They had read the bulletins. They had heard the briefings. And now they were going to test the theory. "Remember the plan?" Haskell murmured. "Don't shoot first. Make him turn." The Tiger's turret rotated with its slow, deliberate menace. Its barrel swept like a pendulum, tracking shadows. Haskell's unit began to move, fast, erratic, deliberate chaos. They darted between cover, then veered to the flank, kicking up clouds of dust. The Tiger turned again. A small maneuver, just a few degrees of rotation, but inside its gears strained under tons of torque. Its driver corrected, pivoted, accelerated. The engine's growl deepened into a metallic snarl. Then came a sharp noise, faint at first like a dry snap. To most ears it would be nothing. But to the men who knew, it was the sound of steel surrendering. Across the field, British observers recorded everything through field glasses. They watched the Tiger start to yaw. Its turret kept moving, but its hull shuddered. Another burst of exhaust smoke, darker now, thick with unburned fuel. Then silence. The Tiger stopped moving. Its gun froze mid-turn. For a long moment, no one dared believe it. Then a hatch clanged open. German crewmen climbed out, not running, just finished. One waved a white rag. The rest stared at the earth. A sergeant whispered almost reverently, "She broke herself." The word spread faster than any official order. Through the regiments, through the camps, from Sicily to Normandy, a rumor turned into belief. The Tiger breaks itself. In Normandy weeks later that phrase became both tactic and morale. The Bocage country with its narrow lanes and hedgerows was perfect ground for light armor to play cat and mouse with the German giants. American and British tankers began coordinating movements to exploit the Tiger's weakness. They didn't need to destroy it outright. They needed to exhaust it. A Sherman platoon would lure the Tiger into tight spaces, forcing sudden direction changes. Infantry units would throw smoke grenades to blind its view, forcing it to reverse. Every forced correction, Every torque surge through its brittle gearbox brought it closer to failure. At first, these incidents seemed like coincidence. But by August, after half a dozen abandoned Tigers were found with intact guns and shattered transmissions, no one doubted anymore. The flaw was real and exploitable. In one after-action report from the 2nd Armored Division, a lieutenant described how his crew baited a Tiger near St. Lo. They reversed into a sunken lane, fired a decoy round, then sped out across a slope. The Tiger followed, twisting hard to angle its gun. Then a flash of sparks, a high-pitched shriek from its drivetrain, and nothing. The great machine coasted to a stop, smoke hissing from its engine deck. They didn't even need to fire again. The Tiger's own transmission had quit the fight. Nearby infantry who once hid from those monsters, now advanced with something new in their step. Confidence. It wasn't arrogance, it was release. After years of fearing that one unstoppable weapon, they had learned its secret. And in that secret was freedom. At night, around field fires, stories spread like gospel. Tankers spoke in low voices, sharing sightings of Tigers left smoking on crossroads, gears jammed, treads locked. Engineers would later inspect them and find the same signature Stevenson had seen under his microscope: fractured martensitic steel, brittle as glass. Some called it luck. Others called it science. Most just called it justice. Even the Germans began to hear the whispers. Captured crewmen admitted, reluctantly, that their machines were failing more often, transmissions seizing mid-turn, final drives cracking under full torque. They blamed the factories, the shortages, the forced labor. But to Allied soldiers it didn't matter. The myth had cracked. A letter from a British sergeant to his wife captured the shift perfectly. "We used to hide from the Tigers. Now we make them dance until they die." You can see it in the men's faces. They believe again. For the first time, the Allies could fight armor with psychology. They no longer measured themselves by caliber or armor thickness. They measured themselves by understanding, and by will. The field commanders noticed too. Reports of successful stress the gearbox engagements became frequent enough to influence planning. Tactics were adapted not just to fight the Tiger but to exploit its pride. Patton staff even coined a phrase for briefing papers: operational fatigue induction, a technical way of saying, make it work itself to death. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. By late summer, burned-out Tigers dotted the countryside from Anzio to Cannes. Some were destroyed by fire, some by airstrikes, but many simply failed from within. Their engines intact, their armor unmarred, but their transmissions fractured like brittle bones. The men who examined those ruins didn't laugh. They felt something closer to reverence. Each wreck was a monument to both human brilliance and human limitation. It reminded them that even the mightiest weapon could fall victim to its own perfection. When Stevenson read the first verified field reports, he felt no triumph. Only quiet satisfaction that reason had served life. He wrote a letter to a colleague at the War Office. "Our work was never about mockery. It was about understanding. The Tiger broke itself because its makers forgot that strength without patience is self-destruction." The phrase would never reach the newspapers. But among engineers, tankers, and tacticians, it became a quiet truth. The war had found its turning point, not in a grand offensive, but in a small revelation whispered between laboratories and battlefields. The Tiger was still a fearsome enemy, but it was no longer immortal. And that made all the difference. From that moment on, Allied crews went to battle not just with courage but with insight. They carried, deep within, the knowledge that even monsters can break, especially when their makers forget to temper their own steel. When the guns finally quieted over Europe, the real numbers began to speak. In warehouses filled with captured German armor, Allied engineers walked among rows of broken giants. Some bore scars of shellfire, but most had simply stopped. Their engines were seized. Their transmissions shattered. Their gears locked in place, as if the machines themselves had chosen surrender. The final reports from the British School of Tank Technology and the U.S. Aberdeen Proving Ground said it plainly: more Tigers had been lost to mechanical failure than to enemy fire. It was a revelation that rewrote the mythology of the battlefield. The Tiger, once the embodiment of invincibility, had become a lesson in limits. Its armor had outmatched the Sherman. Its gun had outranged the Churchill. Yet its own perfection had betrayed it. In pursuit of greatness, its makers had ignored endurance. They built a masterpiece that could not live long in the dirt and chaos of war. In the words of one American officer, the Tiger was built for parades, not for campaigns. It wasn't an insult, it was an autopsy. A clear acknowledgement that genius without pragmatism is doomed to collapse under its own brilliance. For Dr. Robert Stevenson, the man who had first listened to the whispers of steel, the victory was not one of pride. He never sought medals or mention in dispatches. His name appeared only in a line or two of technical memoranda, analysis conducted under direction of Dr. R. Stevenson, School of Tank Technology, Chertsey. No photographs. No interviews. No fame. But to the engineers who worked beside him, he was something more than a scientist. He was the quiet reminder that wars are not won only by those who pull triggers, but also by those who ask the right questions. By 1945, Stevenson had returned to Sheffield, to the echoing halls of steel foundries that once forged Britain's industrial pride. He often visited the metallurgical lab late at night, standing beside the furnaces, watching molten metal swirl like living fire. He used to say softly to his students, "Steel remembers how it's treated. You rush it, you break it. You temper it, and it serves you faithfully." It was the same principle that had broken the Tiger, and, in a way, had helped win the war. Military historians would later trace the Allied armor doctrine's evolution to Stevenson's early findings. The emphasis shifted from building the strongest tank to building the smartest one, reliable, adaptable, sustainable under pressure. The M4 Sherman, often mocked for its lighter armor, became the symbol of that philosophy: easy to repair, easy to produce, and resilient enough to keep fighting. The Tiger might have dominated duels, but the Sherman won the campaign, because it could move, adapt, and multiply. And beneath that difference lay a simple truth: knowledge scales faster than brute force. In a post-war debrief, an American metallurgist summarized it best: "We didn't outgun them. We outlearned them." It was not arrogance, it was respect. The Allies had faced a machine born of obsessive precision and turned its own flaw into a weapon. They had transformed understanding into power. That, in itself, was the essence of progress. By the 1950s, Stevenson's findings were still circulating quietly through engineering academies. Young metallurgists studied his micrographs, the crystalline fractures of untempered martensite, as if they were war relics. Each image told a story of pressure, heat, and time. Each fracture was a frozen scream of a material pushed too far. What Stevenson had proven went beyond the Tiger's gearbox. He had shown that technology has memory, and that war, in the end, is as much about learning from failure as it is about surviving it. In 1961, when the last Tiger tank was cut open for museum preservation, one British curator found an old inspection tag tucked inside the gearbox. The faded handwriting read, "Chertsey, 1943. A quiet mark from the men who had studied it. Perhaps Stevenson's hand, perhaps one of his team. No one could say for sure. But it was fitting. The machine that once terrified armies now stood silent under museum lights, its broken steel immortalized as a teacher. Visitors came, marveled, and walked away impressed by its size, few realizing that its downfall had been written not on the battlefield, but in the grain of its own metal. Looking back, the legacy of that discovery was not just mechanical, it was human. It reminded generations that understanding an enemy is not an act of fear, but an act of mastery. That knowledge, when used with purpose, can end wars faster than any bullet. The men who once fought those Tigers carried that lesson home. Some became engineers, some teachers, some fathers who told their children that even the strongest machines can fail, but the human mind, when tempered by patience, never stops learning. In the end, the war of steel gave way to a peace of understanding. Factories that once forged weapons now forged bridges, railways, and tools for rebuilding. And in every piece of metal that left the furnaces of post-war Europe, there lived the ghost of a Tiger, and the quiet echo of a scientist who had once listened closely enough to hear it break. Because in war, as in life, victory belongs not to those who shout the loudest, but to those who learn the fastest. The war ended, but its lessons did not. In laboratories from Sheffield to Detroit, engineers returned to their benches, older, wiser, and haunted by the same question that had broken the Tiger: how strong is too strong? Dr. Robert Stevenson's reports, once stamped classified, restricted, began to circulate quietly through the new alliance taking shape across the Atlantic. NATO was being born, and with it came a new doctrine, not just of strategy but of engineering. Every tank, every gearbox, Every cannon that followed carried a trace of Stevenson's fingerprint. Design manuals began to include a new golden rule: control the heat, respect the temper, never shorten the process. It was no longer about making the hardest steel, it was about making the right steel. That simple philosophy reshaped the way the West built its machines. Heat treatment schedules were standardized. Quality checks for microstructure became routine. Every batch of hardened steel had to tell its story, not just its strength but its patience. The failures of the Tiger had become the foundation of a safer, smarter generation of weapons. In a sense, Stevenson's quiet discovery had outlived every general and every battle map of the war. By the 1950s, armored divisions across NATO operated under a new creed: reliability is victory. Designers favored systems that could endure the dust, the mud, the freezing cold, not just those that dazzled on paper. A gearbox was no longer just a set of gears. It was a test of discipline. A promise that every soldier in the field could trust the machine beneath his hands. When questioned by a young officer years later, a senior British engineer smiled and said, "The Germans taught us how not to build a tank." At Bovington in southern England, one relic still carries that lesson in its steel. The Tiger 131, the only running Tiger tank in the world. Captured in Tunisia, restored by generations of craftsmen, it stands as both marvel and warning. Each time its Maybach engine roars to life, the museum's engineers listen like doctors to a fragile heartbeat. They never push it. They let it idle, roll forward, turn gently, never too fast, never too sharp. Because they know. Inside that gearbox, deep within its ancient teeth of martensitic steel, the same brittleness remains. 80 years later, the flaw still sleeps there, silent, waiting. One careless turn, one hard pivot, and history could repeat itself. Visitors see the Tiger as a beast reborn, but those who maintain it understand something different. They see it as a monument to human learning, proof that every mistake, when studied with humility, becomes a teacher. When the museum guide speaks, he doesn't glorify its power. He talks about the man who listened to its steel. He tells them about Stevenson, the metallurgist who saw beyond armor and found truth in the smallest fracture. And as the crowd leans closer to that rumbling engine, they hear not the sound of war, but the echo of wisdom forged in fire. Today that wisdom lives on in every field-tested gearbox, every jet turbine, every bridge, every pressure vessel built by hands that remember. Steel is loyal only to those who respect its limits. It's a rule taught to every apprentice metallurgist, often without knowing where it came from. But its origin lies in a battlefield long ago, and in the quiet triumph of a man who refused to stop asking why. History often remembers the weapons, the battles, and the victors. But sometimes the greatest legacy of war is a principle, tempered not by victory but by understanding. Dr. Stevenson never became famous. He never sought it. Yet, through the lessons he left behind, the world learned how to build not just stronger machines, but wiser ones. And in that, perhaps, lies the truest kind of immortality: steel that remembers, and men who learn. When the war ended, Dr. Robert Stevenson went home. Back to Sheffield, the city of smoke, anvils, and iron dust that had shaped him long before the world went mad. He returned not as a hero, not as a name in any newspaper, but as a quiet man who carried the sound of steel in his memory. At the university he took up teaching again. His students remembered him not for his titles but for his stillness, the way he'd hold a piece of metal under the light and whisper, "Listen. It's trying to tell you what it's been through." He never spoke about the war. Not once. When asked what he'd done during those years, he would simply say, "I studied failures." Then he'd smile, the kind of smile that comes from knowing too much about how things break and how people do too. To his students he passed down one simple lesson: strength doesn't come from hardness. It comes from balance. That idea stayed with generations who never knew battle, but who forged their lives in factories, laboratories, and classrooms across the New World. They built bridges, ships, and machines that would outlast them, each one a silent echo of a man who once looked into the cracked heart of a Tiger tank and saw not destruction but a teacher. When Stevenson died, there was no ceremony, no medals on his casket. Just the quiet respect of colleagues who understood that some victories have no parades. Only legacy. Only steel that remembers. Wars end when guns fall silent. But the ideas that won them, those never fade. For all the tanks and aircraft, for every general and strategy, It was knowledge that tilted the scales of World War II. In quiet workshops, in dim laboratories, men and women solved problems that no bullet ever could. They studied why things broke, why engines failed, why steel cracked. And from those failures came the strength of nations. That's the real triumph, not in how many weapons were built but in how much humanity learned. Dr. Stevenson's story is only one among thousands. Scientists, machinists, draftsmen, welders, ordinary people whose ideas shaped extraordinary outcomes. Their tools were not rifles but reason. Their courage was not measured in medals but in persistence. Through them, the Allied victory became more than a military success. It became a victory of thought, of discipline, of imagination. America and the free world it helped defend proved that power without understanding is fragile, but understanding can turn even weakness into strength. That's why every generation must remember, it wasn't the weapons that won the war. It was the minds behind them. Because in the end, America wins wars with ideas, not just weapons.